A Night at Sturgeon Point Lighthouse by Dennis M. Morrison. All lighthouses have a certain mystique that captures the imagination. They kind of make you feel like you want to be a part of them, even if it is just for a night. Such was the case with myself and Sturgeon Point Lighthouse. I first saw this charming structure when I was a teenager. Oh my goodness, I don't even want to think about how many years ago that was now. The lighthouse is now maintained by the Alcona County Historical Society and is a museum. I had always had a desire to spend a night there, though I was certain that would never happen. But then, as you will see, fate smiled on me. I had become quite interested in history, and I was asked by the Alcona County Historical Society if I would serve as their publicity chairman. Of course I accepted. In my first year of service, I took on the task of planning their Historical Day celebration, which would be held on the lighthouse grounds. I began preparations in February 1994, and the celebration would take place in August. That year, Michigan was gripped in the tight fist of one of the coldest winters on record. All the while, I was having a great time planning the events which would take place on what would be a wonderful summer's day. It helped to avoid a severe case of cabin fever and caused the winter to pass by a little more quickly. At this point, let me give you a little history of the lighthouse. It was built in 1864, and it is a wonderful old edifice whose very appearance conjures visions of brave Coast Guardsmen carrying out daring rescues on the storm-tossed waters of Lake Huron. As restored, you enter into the living quarters where you are transported back through time to an era around the turn of the century. First, you come into a long utility room, off which is a large pantry, both fully restored to what they would have been. In the utility room is a long sink with a hand water pump. Next on the tour, you will go up a small set of cement steps to the kitchen. There is an old-fashioned wood cook stove and a fine old dining table. On the north wall are three tall windows which look out over the wooded area, which used to be a horse barn. And on the south wall is the doorway to the parlor, a truly charming room. It is easy to enter. It is easy to enter and imagine the lighthouse keeper entertaining family and friends there. What would their conversations have been like? The parlor has a small wood stove in it, as well as a wonderful old Edison phonograph. The room is filled with all the splendid fixings of that era. The windows from this room look out over a large lawn where the guardsmen's quarters used to be. Off the parlor is a small bedroom with a wrought iron bed, bedstand, dresser, and chamber pot. Down the hall is a library and a steep stairs which lead to a number of display rooms on the second floor. In planning the Historical Day celebration, I had displays lined up that would be coming from all over the state, and some of the people were requesting to be able to set up on the grounds the day before the actual event. This created a problem. The displays could not be left there unattended overnight. Right away, a brilliant idea came to me. I suggested I stay overnight at the lighthouse where I could keep an eye on things. The idea was approved, and I was excitedly looking forward to my night at the lighthouse that I had wanted for so long. Now, being that my daughter Charlene was under 2 and there was no running water, my wife decided she wasn't going to join me. My son Dennis and I were to spend the night there with my friend Ed Baldwin, who was coming from downstate bringing with him an amazing display of Indian artifacts to be set up. At last the eve of the historical day at Sturgeon Point Lighthouse was upon us. At dusk, Kathy and Charlene dropped Dennis and I off at the lighthouse. Ed was already there keeping a watchful eye on displays. As Kathy and Charlene pulled away, the headlights fell on a deer, or 2 deer actually, that ran across the south lawn and down to the lake for a drink. In the close distance to the west, thunder could be heard and lightning seen. With each moment, the impending storm came closer, and what a storm it would be. That evening was hot, humid, and sultry. Dennis and I walked across the lawn towards the lighthouse, and about halfway there, the rain began to pour down. We quickened our pace as the lightning flashed almost blindingly, and the thunder rolled with great anger. The light tower was now casting its beacon, looking strangely eerie against the storm night. Inside, Ed plugged in a hot plate and heated water for some tea. Kathy had left a tasty container of chocolate chip cookies, and so as the storm raged, we had a good time visiting in the kitchen. Now, I thought the storm would ease up, never dreaming it would become an all-night affair. There was one brief break when the rain let up and the three of us walked down to the beach. The lightning arched across the dark sky. It was intense, almost constantly, lighting up and down the Lake Huron shoreline as far as we could see, and the rain began coming stronger again, so after a brief interlude, the three of us headed back inside of the antiquated shelter. About 9 o'clock there came a rapping at the door. Who could it be? Who would be calling on with such a storm raging outside? As I walked down the steps, I expected a Karloff or Lugosi-type figure to greet me at the door. Instead, there was the smiling face of the director of the Thunder Bay Theater from Alpena. The Thunder Bay Theater was going to set up a large tent and do several old-fashioned melodramas for the Historical Day celebration. He had come to ask if it would be all right to set up the tents that night. Well, it was all right with me if they didn't mind getting their backside singed with torches flying down from heaven, and they quickly decided to just drop off their materials and set up the tent in the morning. So in the utility area were stored props and steamer trunks full of costumes. Before retiring to bed, we had another cup of tea and cranked up the phonograph for a listen to some good old-fashioned music. It fit the atmosphere to a T, and suddenly I felt as though I was back in another era at the turn of the century. About midnight, the storm was still going strong. We were all getting pretty tired, so I got Dennis's sleeping bag out and laid it on the floor of the bedroom just off the parlor. Quickly, he was asleep. Ed laid out his sleeping bag on the parlor floor, and I took the wrought iron bed. The bedclothes were damp and musty. I laid there for quite a while staring out the window, and the thunder continued to boom while the lightning flashed. I got out of bed and stood at the window taking in the scenes of nature's fury. I laid back down, and Ed was coughing in the room, so I figured he was still awake, and then suddenly it happened. From the light tower came the most ungodly loud moan that I've ever heard in my life. I suddenly felt cold all over, and I called out, "Ed, was that you?" And there was a brief pause, and he said, "No, Dennis, it wasn't me." "I was hoping it was you," was his tense reply. Little Dennis was sound asleep next to my bed, and I was very much awake, and I bounded from the bed and switched on the light. Ed turned down the light in the parlor, and we sat there for a long time speculating on what might have made the sound. Well, we hit the usual ideas, of course, wind through the tower and that sort of stuff. Nearly 2 hours passed, and we heard nothing else. It really had unnerved us, though. I pulled Dennis's sleeping bag into the parlor, and then then Ed got into his bag. I got in Dennis after I turned out the light. The light wasn't out for more than 2 minutes, and the sound came again. This time, Ed hopped out of the sleeping bag and turned on the lights. I was really scared, and I had thought of us all going over to the gift shop to sleep, but the storm was unabated. It would have been cruel to wake Dennis and cart him out in all that storm. But the sound was totally unnerving, and so totally unnatural sounding. But Dennis was the real trooper. He slept through all of it. Ed and I sat up till about 4 o'clock in the morning and finally drifted off. The rain slowly dissipated until we got up in the morning, and it was a great day for the celebration. The sun was shining. It was hot and humid, just a typically beautiful summer day in August. Late afternoon, an elderly lady walked over to me and expressed how much she enjoyed the day's events. She told me that she had spent most of her childhood at the lighthouse. I explained to her that Dennis, Ed, and I had spent the night there. She looked at me and asked with great seriousness, "Did you hear the moaning?" Needless to say, I was greatly surprised. She said, though, that off and on, for no apparent reason, they would hear the moaning when she lived there as a child. They never figured out what it was. They only knew that it had never caused any harm, so they just let it go, and they ignored it. Well, I still don't know what made the noises that night, but it sure had been an exciting time with the storm and all. I will never forget that night at Sturgeon Point Lighthouse as one of the most interesting nights of my life.